This video looks at basic boning techniques for boning a corset. The focus is on cutting and sewing channels onto the inside of the corset to hold the boning in place. I am working with this Dupion lilac silk fabric, and I have fused a reasonably large section of it. In the spare fabric here left over in the bottom left, I have traced out the strips that I will use for the boning casings. I've got 1.5 centimetres, and then when that seam is pressed open, I will have 1.5 plus 1.5. This means that the casings need to be 3 centimetres wide. I've put together a corset, very simple, quite short corset. This is centre front, working around to centre back. I've cut out all of the pattern pieces. I have fused them all with this sinter coated fusing, and it is good to make the fabric as stiff as you possibly can. The first step is for me to take all of the seams on the corset and to sew them closed. Now I'm working with a regular foot on the machine. I'm stitching on the inside of the garment, so right side to right side, and I am stitching 1.5 centimetres in to stitch a regular 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. Back stitch well. Back stitch well at the end of each seam also. Now I've just finished sewing all of the seams together at 1.5 centimetres. So the next step now is to press all of these seams open. By placing the bust seam over the edge of the ironing board, you can press out the bust seam shape more easily. Now looking at the boning options that we have, these two here are Ridgeline bowlings, and the boning is made up of lots of plastic little fibres or strips. It's like very thick fishing line and held together in this woven structure. So this is quite good, it's quite firm and has quite a good bend on it. The width of this particular one is just over 1 centimetre, so it's about 1.25 centimetres. This comes in white and in black. Another option is this pre-tipped metal boning or steel boning. So this is really quite strong, and it's quite comfortable to wear because it has this solid sort of dipped tip on the end of it. And in fact, you'd need to know in advance making a garment what size bones are available so that you can make the casings the correct size. And then this is another one that's sometimes used in lingerie. It's a metal spring boning. It could possibly be used in costume for theatre because it's a little bit more comfortable to wear, but very little stability. It's very soft. Okay, the next step then is to cut these casing strips that I've previously cut to size. So again, these were cut on the bias with the straight of grain going in this direction and in this direction. That gives them a little bit of curvability. Now, to sew the casing in place, I need to be sure that I'm only stitching the casing to the seam allowance and not through the outside part of the garment. Okay, so moving the rest of the garment out of the way so that all I have is this side of the seam allowance with the casing on top. And then placing that just for a minute under the foot on the machine. And then I often use the boning directly on top of the fabric because that gives me an idea of where I need to stitch. So what I now notice is that if I'm stitching to the right hand side of the boning, actually it lines up perfectly with the edge of the machine. So I'm going to use that as a guide to sew the casings closed. It's very important to remove the boning when stitching the casings. Repeat the process on the other side of the casing, creating a channel the correct width to accommodate the boning. I've now stitched the first casing, and again it's only sewn onto the seam allowance on both sides and is not showing through to the other side of the fabric. So I can do a quick test. The boning should now fit reasonably comfortably in the casing. The seam allowance when I sew the second layer of the corset on, so this is my inside layer and I will be sewing a second layer for the outside of the corset, so I will have a seam allowance here the whole way along the top at 1.5 centimeters down where I sew the inside and the outside pieces together. So I want the boning to stop just under 1.5, because if I fold down here at 1.5, if the boning is right in here, it won't give me enough space to curve the fabric over. So I want to stitch the casing closed by stitching maybe 1.7 centimeters down from the top. So I've placed a pin at the 1.7 point here and at the 1.7 point here. So very important to remember, we're not going to sew through to the outside part of the garment, we're only sewing these two layers where the casing is. Stitch only to the centre of the casing to avoid stitches showing through on the outside of the garment. Back stitch to and fro well to avoid the boning pushing through the seam. I can only sew halfway across, and then I need to come around to the other side to sew closed on this side. So this casing is now closed up at the top. The next step for this casing is to trim the boning to length. So the same will apply at the top to the bottom. So I need to work out 1.7 centimeters up from the bottom is where the boning will end. So just trimming the end here neatly. So 1.7. Lay the boning over the seam and trim to the correct length. So the ends of the boning here can be very, very sharp. So what we normally do is you can get either tips to place over the end, or we work with a lighter just to melt the end. So I'm going to get a lighter. Place the lighter close to the end of the boning, but not too close. Take extreme caution that you do not set fire to the boning. It is a very good idea to do this over a sink. Okay, so taking care not to burn yourself, gently tapping the ends of it. So I've managed to melt the tips of the boning here, and that will now be a lot more comfortable to wear. Okay, you could try tapping it on the table if you don't want to burn your fingers. I can now place the cut and melted boning into the channel. Okay, so you do want to get that boning in nice and taut. This is the bottom end where I'm going to sew it closed. Follow the same procedure as for the top of the casing. So this is the finished boning section. So you'll notice that there are no threads visible on the outside of the garment, and when I turn it over, I had stitched the casing onto the seam allowances only, and when I stitched the boning in, I sewed it closed only on either side of the casing and on either side of the casing down this end. So this leaves me now the possibility when I'm sewing this onto a second layer that there is enough seam allowance to fold it up on both ends. Now to sew the channel on over the seam that goes over the bust, I've actually pinned it quite carefully the whole way along. I'm just going to tidy the extra pieces of seam allowance that hang over the edge so that I can see where the top of the seam is. Once you've sewn the casing carefully in place, follow the same procedure as for the previous casing. Okay, so this is the finished half corset on the inside. I've inserted 4 pieces of boning. This is the bust area, side, and 2 pieces of boning for the back. And you can see I've closed all of the casings off 1.7 centimetres up from the bottom and 1.7 centimetres down from the top. Because I have only been stitching onto the casings and the seam allowance, when this is turned over to the other side, there is no stitching visible from the outside.